Well, greetings everyone. As you can see, I'm back home, and it's sort of a tradition that I have is after I've been gone for a couple months, I usually have a whole bunch of typically books and sometimes other purchases that I've ordered and they're kind of waiting for me, and it's sort of like a welcome home Christmas gift. And this was an extended time that I was out working, and so I was kind of not prepared for how many books. I had forgotten how many I had ordered. I'm counting, and you can see those are the ones that were delivered. There's 42, and yeah, I don't know when I'll be able to read them all, but some of you find that interesting. There are some books here that were recommended by some of my subscribers, so you'll get to see that I did that, and also uh, one of my subscribers, the head of the UK Libertarian website, just before I left, um, he said he wanted to buy me a book, and so I worked it out. Amazon has a way that they can do that, and I told him that I wouldn't see it until I got back. This is back in July, and of course I'm back now in October, and I assume that one of these is from him, but I don't know which one. And part of the reason I'm doing this is so if he happens to watch this, um, he can let me know. I'd like to thank him for it, but I don't even know which one to thank him for, although I have a suspicion which one it is. So I'm gonna go through these pretty brief. I haven't read these, so I can't really do over. There's so many I can just lean on them like this. All right, so right here, part of my Chinese history. You've got the Cambridge History of China, Volume 7, the Ming Dynasty, Part 1. For those of you who don't know, the Oxford or the Cambridge University Press puts out these Cambridge history of, and they have them of the Near East, of Europe, of Iran, of China. And they're usually pretty comprehensive and large. I have a large number of them. Like the set for the ancient history, like the ancient Mesopotamia, Greece, and all that. I think it's something like a 30-volume set, and it's something like $3,000 or $4,000 if you get the whole set. You might be able to get it for less if you parse out each volume. I have maybe about half of it. The China set, I'm not planning to get the entire China set, but it's fairly comprehensive. You divide up the Ming into, this is only volume 1. Yeah, that's a pretty good roundabout way. But anyway, so that's one. And we've got, I can go pile after pile so they don't have a long pile. The Victory of Reason, How Christianity Led to Freedom, Capitalism, and Western Success. I believe, if I'm remembering this right, Robert Higgs posted on his Facebook that he read this book. Looks relatively short, so that might be one that I might actually read soon. And then here we have the volume 2 of the Ming Dynasty. Considerably thicker. All of the History of China ones, though, have the same picture on the front. That looks like that's a Ming era illustration, but I could be wrong. There we go. I think I'm done on buying books on the Ming, but I still have to read these. The Bomb in the Basement, How Israel Went Nuclear and What That Means for the World. There's quite a lot of espionage and intrigue involved in the Israeli nuclear program that I find pretty fascinating. I don't know how ultimately important it is. I've heard lots of stories about the Israelis kind of having Armageddon-type plans of, if we don't have our way, we'll launch a nuclear war intended to trigger a third world war and use this as kind of a bargaining chip. I don't know if that's really true. I don't know if this book is even going to deal with that, but that's kind of I forget what they call it, the Samson option, something like that. That's what I've heard anyway. I don't know if any of that's true, but it should be an interesting book. Allegedly, they kind of stole / bought everything from the United States, but I'm sure this book will cover it. Now, this, ironic, they both came up at the same time. I have 2 of the same book, The Whiskey Rebellion. Now, I guess there's a good chance one of these was bought to me as a gift and one of them I bought myself, or Also, very possible I may have just bought two. That could happen. Let me see if it even says. Oh, yeah. This is from, it says right here. Well, thanks. I won't say your name. Obviously, I think it's a great book because I have two of them now. That was a risk. I was cognizant of that possibility going through, but I didn't want to ask him to tell me what book he got because I wanted to be surprised. And I figured my Amazon wish list has, I don't know, 700 or 800 books, so I figured there's a good chance that we wouldn't overlap. But I guess not. This is apparently a very good book. Again, I believe I had this reference by Robert Higgs at a different time. So 2 copies of that. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's Invasion of Russia, 1941, by David M. Glantz. If you type in his name, you can see some very interesting lectures by him about the Eastern Front. That he's made that kind of the point of his career, he's a historian, to study the war on the Eastern Front, and this is a book about it. So, oh, here we have Israel and the Bomb by Avner Cohen. Again, another Israel book. Cohen's book will necessitate the rewriting of Israel's entire history. Hurrahs. Yeah, that should be good. I don't know if I'll read them both in sequence. If I have books that are very similar, a lot of times I'll parse them out and not read them all at the same time so I don't get too bored. Okay. I'll talk about this in a minute. The Russian Origins of the First World War by Meekin. So, it's October now. There's no cover on this book. No. But in August, of course, there's a lot of World War I anniversary stuff going on because it was the 100th anniversary of the start of the war. There's basically this entire year is kind of marking the centennium of a whole bunch of important World War I events. There has been a lot of scholarship as to kind of who caused the war. Obviously, the Allies blamed the Germans, and they won the war and got the reparations. So it's kind of the general consensus among popular culture, but among scholars, this is kind of debated quite a bit. And there was a book written in the '60s that kind of made this very strong case. It's very popular that it was Germany's fault. And then this is a more recent book, again by a guy named McKeekin, Mcmeekin, that makes the argument that Russia is the culprit for World War I, or at least more culpable than everybody else. I think that's the case where everyone's culpable, but I kind of think this is a balanced way to look at it. Read the book that says it's the Germans' fault, read the book that says it's the Russians' fault, and you'll have a better idea. There's been a lot. I mean, the potential for Russia to become a hegemonic power was long recognized in Europe, and there was an understanding that if it ever got its act together, if it could be as efficient in mobilization of power as some of the European states, that its vast reserves of both human and natural resources would make it, basically invincible or far stronger than any of the other European states. And German aggression in both world wars, this isn't just a Hitler thing, is very well likely has that as a strategic understanding. So that should be a good book. Unfortunately, this does not look that thick, and the typing's not that big either. So I might read this relatively soon. Definitely looks interesting. I did a number of purchases to kind of fill a gap in my historical understanding. There were 2 nation states / empires that I was aware of, but that I knew next to nothing about. These are progenitors to the Iranian society. So I have here the decline and fall of the Sasanian Empire, the Sasanian Parthian Confederacy, and the Arab conquest of Iran. I've heard of the Sasanian Empire. I've heard of the Parthians more because the Parthians were largely contemporary with the Roman Empire. Um, but I know next to nothing about them. I know there was a strong Hellenistic influence because that area was ruled by Alexander the Great and then by the Seleucid Empire for many, many years. Um, but I know very little about these societies. So books like this are kind of a good way to kind of learn more about them and their place within the world. Connect the dots on the map, so to speak. The glory and the fall of the Ming dynasty. Not sure why I bought this book other than it's about the Ming dynasty. And we got a picture there of Emperor, I forget his name. Here we go. So the analog to the Russian origins is the Germany's Aims in the First World War by Fritz Fischer. Ivan the Heathen and I discussed this book a little while ago. So this is considered quite a classic work. Looks like it. Yeah, it's from the 60s or 70s. This copy might even be that old. But yeah, this is one of those things where you read both sides of the argument and you probably have a better idea than if you'd only read one. So that should be good. I'll definitely read that. Can't say when, but and one of the things, you know, that kind of happens when you read, say, a lot of history, it gets easier and easier. The more you know, like, you kind of are able to piece together parts of the puzzle before you even look at them. So, reading a lot about China, you end up reading about, you know, peripheral societies, and of course the one that's probably the most famous, the society. There's two, like Japan and China have had a long history of kind of antagonism and not just antagonism but interchange. Then the other one is the Mongols, and the great thing about the Mongols is they span Eurasia, and so, you know, Mongols have interactions with Europeans and with Arabs, and, you know, understanding them is kind of like a kind of a connecting linchpin for most of history. So I read a book called Defending Heaven about the Song dynasty's struggles against the Mongols, especially Kublai Khan. I enjoyed that book. It was a good book, and it made me think I should read more about the Mongols. So I bought several books on the Mongols. So this one is called The Mongol Conquests in World History by Timothy May. Mostly what I would do is I would just look up these books and then read their reviews, read professional reviews, and then just Amazon reviewers, and you get a sense of how well regarded the books are, you know, what they contain, and that's usually a pretty sound basis for a purchase, especially when you're talking about 10, 15, 20 bucks. It's not a big deal, right? So that'll be good. And then kind of related to that, another section of history that, again, I've read about ancillary, like the sides of it, but never directly. That would be Arab history or Islamic history. One of the authors, the author of Defending Heaven, had written several books initially about Arab conflicts with, well, not just Arab, but Islamic conflicts with the Mongols. And so I bought several of his books on this. This is actually about, this title, The Ismaili Assassins, The History of Medieval Murder. That seems like a trendy kind of title, and let's connect it to today. But still interesting, worth reading probably. Roman Persia in the Late Antiquity. So, right, so this will be about the Parthians and their struggles against the Romans. This one's kind of out of the blue. I didn't get many books on this yet, but we have a warrior dynasty, and of course you can guess what country would have a title, a warrior dynasty. The Mongols, the Muslims, you know, the Aztec. No, it's the rise and fall of Sweden as a military superpower. Here we go. Anyone at all familiar with the 60-year or the 30 Years' War will know that Sweden was once a very important power in Europe. It's not so much anymore, but you know, again, who hasn't heard of Gustavus Adolphus, and what is it, Charles X or Charles VII or whoever it was who lost the Battle of Poltava. Um, yeah, the Swedes were actually, actually the Swedes were actually important in Chinese history, believe it or not. Uh, there was a major defeat in the Battle of Poltava. Many Swedes were captured by the Russians, and some tended to have technical skills far beyond what the Russians possessed. Um, the Tsars actually utilized many of these Swedes in terms of surveying and construction and engineering, and then some of these Swedes ended up getting later captured by the proto-Mongolian state of the Oirat Mongols in Central Eurasia, and helped design and build some Mongol cities. And one of those guys eventually made it back to Sweden, which sounds like quite a odyssey. And apparently he wrote a whole bunch of stuff and made maps and stuff from Mongolia back in the 1700s that are in the library there. And one of my Swedish friends actually said he was going to go try and check that out, but I don't know if he ever did. He said he'd asked the library and they never got back to him. But anyway, and a thin book, so not very daunting in terms of reading, so that's good. We have Sasanian Persia, the rise and fall of an empire. So I tried to get several on both the Sasanian and the Parthians, and I think between the two I will have really caught up on my Iranian history. Let's see, we got Cambridge History of China, Volume 10, the Late Qing. Notice the spelling; they're not using pinyin, or they're not using Wei Giles; they're using pinyin. Or did I have that backwards? But it's spelled with a CH apostrophe instead of the QING, which is the way I like it better. But yeah, so this covers 1800 to 1911. So this is basically the end. But of course, there's only part one. So the Qing dynasty gets 4 volumes. If that gives you any indication of the scope of this. And the Qing dynasty is not the longest lasting dynasty of China, although there probably is much more material on it, since there's European sources and the Chinese sources are probably better too. Let's see. Subscriber or commenter rather recommended this book on my Israel video, The Wandering Who, A Study of Jewish Identity Politics by Gilad Etzman. So if you are the one who recommended this, I did buy it. It looks like a short little book. Again, you read the Amazon, has all these negative reviews. Oh, Zionism, Holocaust, blah, 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 blah. People need to learn about crying wolf, because at this point, who's going to take you seriously? This was recommended, Anarchy Unbound, Why Self-Governance Works Better Than You Think. Oh, by Peter Leeson, all right. Yeah, Peter Leeson, most famous, I think, for his work on piracy. In fact, the person who recommended this book to me started talking about pirates, and I thought, oh yeah, that's Leeson. He said this book was quite good and quite convincing. So I'll definitely check it out, and it's relatively short. Hitler's 30 Days to Power, January 1933. Yeah, like the politics involved in Hitler becoming chancellor, and then the chancellorship becoming a dictatorship as opposed to a normal office. It's glossed over. I know some of the details. I've read about them. It's in the Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. Clearly there was a lot of political maneuvering, and he was in a position that did not necessitate he become dictator. In fact, many people believe that his election marked the end of his political career. Not his election, but his rising to the post of chancellor, many people thought would be the end of him. And they were wrong, and he ended up, becoming the most absolute dictator, in German history, one of the most absolute dictators in world history, and I believe it's probably useful to study that in great detail. The dramatic history of the fateful month that gave rise to the most destructive leader in the 20th century. Debatable, that title, that's on the back. It's quite large text on the back. This book I've heard referenced many times. I think this is a subsequent edition. This is, I believe, to be considered fairly definitive. That's nice big type, so this isn't going to be a long Yeah, there's Prince von Papen. I know he was going to be in there. Yeah, so this is probably, I mean, Hitler being such a popular topic, it makes sense to know, because most people aren't going to know anything about that. I would imagine. So that'll be good. And then this came out of partially with a previous book that I read that always made me consider coming back and covering this topic again. But this came from a Tom Woods interview, Bourgeoisie Virtues: Ethics for the Age of Commerce, by Deidre, formerly Donald McCloskey. Right there. For those of you who don't remember, she wrote, this is the second part in a trilogy, the third part, which is finished but not released. The first part is called Bourgeoisie Dignity. That is an excellent book, one of the most iconoclastic books that I think I've ever read, along up with Azar Gott's On War, in terms of the scope and the breadth and how much it makes you think. I had heard it recommended basically by Gary North years and years and years ago. And, Deidre or Donald, however you want to say it, really does a great job of emphasizing the importance of the Industrial Revolution and the radical departure with previous historical trends that it represents, and then also discussing how maybe it happened. Was it, and why the Industrial Revolution? This is probably the most important event in human history up to this point, or very close to it anyway. It's debatable, I suppose, but people don't even know why it happened, and that book is a deconstruction of the supposed reasons. Oh, it's because of coal, or it's because of trade, or it's because of property rights, or it's because of race, or whatever else. Um, she basically deconstructs all of those, but in the process, you learn a huge amount. Um, so, yeah, definitely, McCloskey is worth reading. I would probably start with Bourgeoisie Dignity first, and if you like that, try this. Um, it's a little bit pricey. I think this is maybe $35, but whatever. Um, and she also emphasizes, and this is a little known. Every once in a while, people will ask me about this. Um, the importance of the Dutch Republic in the rise of capitalism and of the Industrial Revolution. Of course, Great Britain kind of gets all the credit here, but there's very strong reasons to think that that society, that the British were mimicking what had just happened in Holland. Um, when the Low Countries broke away from Spain in the iconoclasm of 1572, and then there was the so-called 80 Years' War after that. What emerged was a radically different society. I believe McCloskey's view is that the most radical difference wasn't a physical one so much as a difference in the zeitgeist and how especially commerce was viewed. So really throws a lot at you. McCloskey, read her resume; it's very impressive, and listen to her interview. She's done 2 with Tom Woods, and they're both worth listening to. This was not the only book that I bought based off that interview, by the way. All right, this book is one that I've toyed around buying for a while. It's been recommended more than once or twice. It is The State in the Third Millennium, by none other than Hans Adam II, the reigning Prince of Liechtenstein. Yes, the reigning Prince of Liechtenstein. Right, so apparently this is quite a libertarian book, but we will see. It looks like it's fairly short. The right of self-determination. Hmm. Honestly, I thought this book was about the third millennium BC. It's apparently about the third millennium now, so that'll be different. But several people have recommended this book to me. I don't know any other books by the reigning Prince of Liechtenstein, um, but yeah, it's been recommended a couple times, so there it is. I feel embarrassed now that I didn't realize. All right, Again, to the World War One, you can just tell I've been gone so long. There's a lot of these books that I bought in August. Ring of Steel, Germany and Austria-Hungary in World War One. The People's War. Oh, this is a beast. This one, I think this is relatively new. Fuck, that's huge. And with small type. My goodness. Um, well, of course, so Germany and Austria-Hungary obviously had an alliance, pivotally important in terms of world history. Um, is it important enough to read a book like this? I would say so. So here we go. And again, World War One. Again, there's such a tendency to focus in a nationalistic kind of narrow way and kind of view it like from the Western Front, and that's not even half the war. This is true in World War One, and especially it's even more true in World War Two. And which is not to say you shouldn't study the Western Front, or absolutely studying battles the United States took part in is totally fine. But if you're focusing only on that, you're missing 80-90% of what's out there in just that one particular war. So I'm not sure why. I think this was Amazon algorithm talking, but I read good reviews. So I mean, I got some interesting charts here. Psychiatric rates of internment in the German army. Wow. Okay. So that should be good. Now, this is another book that came off of the Deirdre McCloskey, Tom Woods interview. They referenced an economist named P.T. Bauer, a British economist who's done a lot of work on third world economies, and I think I have 2 of his books here. And I think it's 4 or 5 you can find on Amazon. Some of them are collections of essays. I believe I bought 2, but this one is Equality, the Third World, and Economic Delusion. Basically, I believe, this is the way Tom Woods summarized it and McCloskey assented. So I think between the 2 of them, if they both agree, it's likely a fair analysis that the third world has a big problem with capital production because there's too much collectivism. And whenever one person gets into money, his extended family shows up and says, hey, give us, you have money, you have to give it to us now. And yeah, so they have the kind of communism that socialists think is great, or collectivism that a lot of wealth redistributionists think is great, but then they live in thatched roofs and mud brick houses, or made out of dung maybe even. And yeah, that's probably why I'm going to read this book. This one, a similar analysis of real world socialism failing. The Kibbutz Awakening from Utopia by Daniel Gavron. I saw the author of this book interviewed in, I don't even remember what it was about, but it gave him as the author of this book, and I read some of the stuff about it. Quite interesting. Basically, the idea of you have these very socialist-minded people grouping together, forming kibbutzim in a way other than like the genocidal expropriation of the land from the original inhabitants when that happened, which is not always what happened with kibbutz. I'm not going to say that. But of a type that many anarcho-capitalists would tacitly agree with. Kind of a breakdown where people are like, nah, like we're not all equal. It doesn't make sense to have everything be common. I don't, my kids have particular needs or particular wants, and the idea, whatever. I believe that's what this is about. It looks fairly small, so my guess is it's going to be interesting. But I think this would be great ammunition for the next time. Some monarcho syndicalist whose only experience in the labor force is to read several blogs. Hey, what you want doesn't really work. Here's an example. Okay, so Imperial China, 900 to 1800. I don't know. That seems like a little light for that kind of topic, but it's an overview. This came well recommended, though, I believe. This is by F.W. Moat. Yeah. This looks pretty good. Again, this is one of those things, like if you don't want to read multiple books about every dynasty, yeah, read an overview and then go from there. Stuff like this is really good to start with. All right, this one was recommended by Ivan the Heathen. He'd recommended it a couple times. But we have here The King's Two Bodies, a study in medieval political theology by Ernest K. Kantorowicz. One thing I will say about medieval legal theory, it's surprisingly relevant because our legal theory is still like an outgrowth of this. There's two books, Law and Revolution Part 1 and Part 2, that talk about this in great depth. And honestly, like it's hard for me to read about legal theory. I never finished Law and Revolution. I got about halfway through, and it was fascinating, but it was like eating vegetables. Um, Hopefully this will be easier for me to more palatable for me. But it is important because like both our tort law, felonies, all that originates in the Middle Ages basically. Um, Ivan told me basically a breakdown of what this is. I'm not going to go over right now, but hey Ivan, I did buy it. It's on my shelf and I will get to it. Um, Not to say you shouldn't make a video about it though before. I'm gonna have to organize all this. Here we go. This one was cheap. Revolution 1989, the fall of the Soviet Empire. It just looked good. Um, we've all seen the videos. I've seen them many times. I've seen many documentaries, but I haven't really studied it. I think the chronology would be interesting. So, a must-have accounting. So yeah, I mean, it's a must-have accounting. I believe this was like $1. So this is one of those throwaways. You pay the shipping and it's at your house. Do. Another David M. Glantz. Barbarossa derailed. The battle for Smolensk from the 10th of July till September 1941. Volume 1. Wow. And then the subtitle. The German advance, the encirclement battle, and the first and second Soviet counteroffensives. That's the subtitle. This is big. So this whole book is about the advance and encirclements in that 1 month period, just over 1 month period in July and August 1941. Having listened to Glantz and having read one of his other books, although about a much later period, one large misconception about this Eastern Front in World War II is that everything was going great until Stalingrad. 1941, the year Barbarossa started, even though it is the largest, most destructive land invasion in the history of the world. This is the largest military conflict ever. Was an enormous strategic disaster for the Germans. A war-ending, although it took several years, disaster. Now, what they inflicted on the Soviets is, and I think no less a man than what's his name? The guy who wrote Gula, Solzhenitsyn said, to call the Soviet achievement a victory is kind of ironic because it's the greatest losses ever by a population, really, in a war. And yeah, that's how people like to talk about it. But the Soviet counteroffensives in the first summer were themselves quite devastating and effective. The Soviets raised many armies that they threw against the Germans, and yeah, the German offensive failed utterly in its aims. Now, big book. If you type his name though on YouTube, you can see him giving lectures. This is so big. Their entire counteroffensives involving millions of men that have no acknowledged battle name or anything. In fact, usually Kursk is considered the largest tank battle ever. The puny German attempt to reduce a salient in 1943. And he says there were battles in 1941 that involved many times as many tanks, and they're just not remembered. The Soviets covered a lot of it up because many of those generals, if they weren't executed by Stalin, they had political careers later. They didn't want people to remember their defeats in the war, and so they just never talked about them, and they didn't share that information with the West until now. Here we have Sasanian Iran, 224 to 651 CE. Portrait of a late antique empire. Very small, which is one of the reasons I wanted to buy it, I believe. And big type, too. So, You know, if you've never heard of the Sasanian Empire, you read this book, boom, you know more than anybody you'll ever meet. All right, here we go. We have war crimes against southern civilians. Tom Woods has referenced this book many times. It doesn't look that big. Basically, a cataloging of war crimes committed in the Civil War. I heard Shelby Foote once say there are no records of rape ever occurring, although he, says obviously it must have occurred. Um, However, there was such a stigma attached to reporting it that many people never would. But also, I don't know. According to him, it's an indication that it maybe not. It wasn't as common as Ward tends to imply. I don't know. Maybe this book will teach me different. Um, Woods has pointed out that of all the bereaved groups you can talk about in U.S. history, for some reason the Southern civilians don't count, and a lot of the reasons why people would justify not counting them, slavery, blah blah blah, they don't really pass muster because many of the Southern civilians did not own slaves and weren't necessarily fighting for slavery. You know, to an extent, most of them, like people everywhere, are kind of not totally helpless, but at the mercy of their government, in this case, the Confederate States of America, and to blame them in person and say that aggression against them is justified because their government, blah blah blah. Very Ayn Rand kind of attitude. It doesn't even square with like most of the mainstream kind of political, philosophical, ethical debate, and yet it seems to be the case with Southerners. Um, I've heard Lou Rockwell say Southerners are the only group that you can actively berate, and it's because they have the temerity to stand up to the federal government. I believe that is a dramatic oversimplification, and yet there's a grain of truth in that. So that should be interesting. I don't know where I'm going to put all these, by the way. Okay, we have Sacred Swords, Jihad in the Holy Land. This is by the same guy who did the other books. This was his actual main area of interest. His main area of expertise was the conflicts between the Muslims and the Mongols, and then he wrote a book about the Mongols and the Chinese. Fascinating. There was actually, people talk about how advanced the Chinese were. In the 13th century, the most advanced like military technology was in the Arab world, and the Mongols actually took Arab engineers to China to aid. Kublai Khan had Arab engineers building trebuchets, and because there were sieges in the Yuan conquest of Song China that lasted 5 years, and with cities that could not be taken, and they brought over Arabs to do it. So, the idea that China has always been like technologically so superior is a very simplified kind of view of things. And then we have again the Mongols. Man, that's a short book for a title like that, but here it is. It's pretty small type though. These are one of those things you plow through these in a couple days and boom, 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 and it makes you feel smart because you're reading fast. All right, we have about several of this guy's books. The Myth of the Robber Barons, A New Look at the Rise of Big Business in America by Bertrand F. Folsom. Go onto Amazon and type Bertrand F. Folsom and look at the book titles he has. I believe also I got this after hearing him interviewed on Tom Woods. I think he teaches at Hillsville College or Grove City College, one or the other. He's done a lot of good stuff about turn of the century, capitalism, industrialism, free markets versus what we have, mixed economy. Fairly small too, so it's one of those things you could read pretty quick. And I mean, he's got full-size pictures in here. Bethel Steel. Yeah, so like this isn't even as big as you'd think. It's got full pages. This is the other Peter Bauer, From Subsistence to Exchange and Other Essays. Peter Bauer. Subsistence to Exchange, yes. Caruso Economics. That should be good. Then we have The Knights of Islam, the wars of the Mamluks. Everyone's heard of the Mamluks, including me, and I know essentially nothing about them other than they kind of kicked out the Crusader kingdoms. that's probably, of the books that he's written that I have, I'll probably read this one first. This is definitely the one that strikes my interest the most. Other than maybe this one, Mongols and Mamluks, the Mamluk Ilkhanid War, by Raven Amatai Price, Cambridge University Press. This looks like this would also be good. So again, this is, you read these two books, and then you know about the Mamluks, and this one dark area in your historical understanding of the world is filled in, and it connects the dots to everything else, because you'll learn about their interactions with the Europeans and with the Mongols. I mean, yes. I'm going for as a complete an understanding as I can get. I'm just curious. I want to know. I mean, I don't have a checklist, but, you know, there we go. So there's that. And then last, I've heard this book referenced a couple times. It's a bit different than I thought. It's called A Critical History of Greek Philosophy by W.T. Stace. And look how big. It's thin, but big. It almost looks like a coloring book. So that should be good. You know, I'm going to keep dabbling in philosophy. I'm not ready to jump all the way in, but something like that will help. So those were all the books that I bought through Amazon that were delivered to my house. Those weren't the only items that I bought. We have here a flanged mace with octagonal symmetry. This I got from Cult of Athena, and this is nice. I think I'm going to keep this in my car. Yeah, my roommates wondered what exactly I had ordered. This is not that expensive. This is, I believe, based off of 16th century German designs. Yeah, there's hardened steel. This is not solid. This is hollow, but I believe it's fairly stiff. It feels quite. You can't break it. Yeah, that'll wake you up in the morning. And then I also purchased this. This is a Jian style sword. I wouldn't. It looks rather ornate, but I wouldn't say that it's really that high quality. It looks good though. The hilt's kind of hard to take off, but straight sword. The edge is not that sharp as coming. I think it would need to be sharpened if you were going to really use it. Yeah, but I like it's quite light. It feels quite alive in the hand. Almost all the weight feels like it's in the hilt. I don't know if it's full tang. My guess is that it's not, but I can't be sure. For what I paid, it should be. I also got this from Cult of Athena. This was made in China, which I honestly don't think is a plus, to be honest. The craftsmanship is okay. You can see blemishes. They're not bad, and I don't care. I'm not getting a showpiece. I wanted a Jian style sword for some time, and I splurged. But yeah, I don't know if this one's gonna go in my car or not. Probably not. But yeah, it does make quite sound when you close it. Yeah. It's nice scabbard. I really don't care about scabbards, but it does look nice. It's probably has these Chinese characters probably say "fuck you, Whitey" or something to that effect. But yeah, my roommates were doubly curious about what this was. I also made a large purchase of blades from Zombie Tools, which Skylar Nelson had reviewed some time ago. And those are the blades that I showed, and in some of my other videos I pulled them out. People asked about them. I bought quite a few, and I'm actually going to do a separate video where I review those. This channel is never going to be about reviewing blades or whatever. There's other people who do that, and I'm not going to get into it. But it is kind of interesting to talk about you know, the objective, subjective value of things, and you know, our potential. These are things that are potentially useful. Now, most of the reason to have them is, you know, not because you're going to practically use them all the time, but they could be useful. I would feel safer walking down the park at night with this in my hand or at nearby than without having it, because this is definitely a melee weapon. You can use this. You swing, you hit. I mean, those are sharp. I mean, they're not bladed sharp, but you swing. I think it only weighs 3 or 4 pounds at the head, but because that's where the fulcrum is, I mean, it gets a lot of energy. Physics majors don't like fault me for getting that wrong, but yeah, definitely cool. So anyway, I'll try and upload some other videos here. I have topics I want to talk about that I just wasn't able to because I was busy with work. Uh, I can't imagine. Well, I'm sure some of you will have watched this to the very end. If you did, let me know. That'd be cool because I don't know. I didn't really talk about an actual topic here, and it's still 45 minutes long. Just a lot of you seem really interested in what I read, how I go about reading things, and you can kind of see there's a pattern. You read about China, and then you think, oh, Mongols. You get a whole bunch of books about the Mongols, and then you think, oh man, Sasanians and Islam, and of course the Muslim armies took over the Sasanian Empire, and that's a whole. I know that happened, but I know very little about the actual process, and I imagine somewhere in that pile is a pretty detailed recollection of what happened, probably from multiple points of view, which is the best way to kind of study something. Um, so, yeah, I guess we got a lot of China, a lot of Mongols, a lot of the Arab world, the Mamluks, a little bit on World War II, quite a bit on World War One. So yeah, I mean that's probably a year's worth of reading or thereabouts for me anyway. And yeah, and by the time I've read all that, I'll be a much wiser person. So that's kind of the goal. I just have to figure out where I'm going to stack them all. But anyway, I hope you're all doing very well, and let me know if you've read any of these books, if you have any other recommendations. Well, don't people recommend books, and I say, look, I have a problem. I have too many already. So like I get people like almost not pleading, but like, please read this and do a video. I'm like, I can't. You read it and you do a video. A couple of you have done that, and I applaud you for doing so because like there's no reason it's all got to be on one person. And me giving a summary in a video is not the same thing as reading it yourself. I'm not telling you what to do. It's your life and your time and whatever, but um, you don't get the same out of it as you would. And don't read the same things as me, man. Pick whatever you think is interesting, you want to learn about. Become an autodidact, I think, is the main thing. If you do that, you'll be fine. So that's pretty much it. I've made other purchases that I'm not showing on here. Um, but yeah, probably my next video will be a zombie tools review. There aren't any really good zombie tools reviews online that are en masse. Seems like most of the people who buy that shit can't afford to get much of it. I've just been very fortunate, and I bought quite a bit. I think I sated my thirst for bladed weapons, uh, and I think for gun weapons as well. So that's good. I can just focus on more important things than that. But anyway, yeah, I'll talk to y'all later. Have a good day.